The question of the day currently is, just where am I right now? There's just something about this place that I gotta ask the question, where am I? And hopefully you'll see what I mean as I get into this. But to start, I recently watched The Good Place. This is a television series where the plot twist is that these characters die and they find themselves in what appears to be the afterlife, and specifically what appears to be a heaven-like existence. And the twist of the series is that, well, no, actually, the place that they find themselves in is actually what they call the bad place. And it's a creation of demons designed to torture the human beings that find themselves in this place. But the torture is not actually done by the demons in this new simulation that they created. Rather, it's the humans that torture themselves through their own interactions into eternity, which is pretty dark. But it did get me thinking a little bit about my own views regarding where it is I currently am. You have certain experiences in nature that make you believe with all of your heart that you are connecting with something real. But given the nature of everything else in this reality, I have to allow for the possibility that things aren't quite what they seem. Not that that feeling isn't legitimate, just that maybe that's a feeling that is coming from somewhere else inside of me. Perhaps a distant memory of a place that has no relationship to where we are right now. Let's start with the food chain. First, just look at what it's called from the start. The food chain. What are prisoners locked up with? Chains, right? Now, of course, if you looked in any textbook describing the food chain, it would just be this thing where they say, well, yes, everything is metaphorically chained together and each thing is dependent on the other thing for its own survival in that way. So it's a food chain, like a chain link fence. But there's always dual meaning taking place with the English language in many different ways. You know, you start with the food chain and how it is feeding your cells. And then, yes, of course, they call prison cells the same name. You know, there's always this dual meaning taking place. But of course, that doesn't mean there's any legitimacy fundamentally to that dual meaning. It's just some word sorcery that's being foisted upon us by intelligences that are far beyond our current collective intelligence. But the food chain is something that has always bothered me. Well, not always, but as I became more aware of what was taking place here, it really started to bother me. In the sense that there was no logic to it. Why would you create a place where life consumes life and has no other choice but to consume other life to survive? And when you're placed in that sort of situation, it's not much of a choice at all, right? You're going to choose the survival of your body over any sort of philosophical concerns over the legitimacy of the food chain, which requires all of us to consume sentient awareness to perpetuate the existence of our bodies. You could say, well, no, you have a choice whether or not you consume another sentient creature. And you have to take a step back and look at the situation and say, well, in our current civilization, you have a choice, but you only have that choice due to the synthetic supplements and vitamins that have been created to replace what you would not otherwise receive if you did not eat those sentient creatures. That makes it possible to have the choice of whether or not you're going to do that. But if you were just placed into the wild outside of civilization from the time that you were born, you would legitimately have no choice. There are vitamins in your body that literally require what is found in the flesh of sentient creatures. Otherwise, if you do not receive these vitamins, your body will break down. And so, if you were in the wild, you would have no choice. You would have the drive to hunt and consume another sentient creature in order to perpetuate your own survival. And so I'm looking at this situation and this alleged food chain, which that is just one aspect of it. When you look at the rest of nature, it's very violent. There is so much parasitical activity taking place. I mean, you can look into all sorts of wild stuff where insects and other things are mind controlling other insects into doing their bidding and becoming their food source to sustain themselves. There's all kinds of crazy stuff going on in this quote unquote food chain, to the point where nature is violent. And you look at it like, really? Is this the design? Is this what I would create if I was in the situation to create something? I apologize in advance for how graphic this is going to be, but it's the only way to sufficiently make my point here. In nature, as I speak right now, there is currently a sentient creature being eaten alive, laying on the ground and still aware as another sentient creature sinks its teeth into its flesh and eats its insides while it's still alive. And if you were in the wild in the same way and you became separated from your tribe, the very same thing could happen to you. You could be eaten alive. Imagine laying there as an animal began to eat your intestines while you were still conscious. This is what I'm referring to when I'm pointing out how violent quote-unquote nature is here, and how absurd the food chain is. Is this really the design that makes sense? Now, my mind is so small that I can't really comprehend the level of awareness that would even be able to create something on the scale that we are perceiving, so that's very difficult for me to say. And of course, there would be the logical response of, well, if you look at some of the indigenous tribes, specifically in America, the Native Americans, they had a much better relationship with the environment, and specifically as it's relating to what I'm talking about right now, they had a much closer relationship to the sentient creatures that they hunted and killed to sustain the existence of their tribes. They did it in a more reverent way, and they were more connected to the process because they were actually taking the life themselves as opposed to the situation we have now where the majority of people are removed from that step and just pick up the finished product, which is just the flesh of the creature that has been drained of all the fluids and the blood, so all you are interacting with is the piece of quote-unquote meat. But still, the indigenous populations are just as violent as nature itself. They were not different in that way. And so there is something about being a part of this food chain that makes you necessarily have a tendency towards violence. And again, I look at that and say, is this the way it's supposed to be? Getting back to the question of the good place versus the bad place, being tricked into thinking that you're in a good place when that might not be the case. But then you have to take that question to an even deeper level where you say, well, okay, I look at the construction of the human body. It's an amazing creation. It's incredible when you look at it. But like I said, we have this intricate digestive system that requires and takes away certain vitamins from what is put into it, which then sustains the body. And in this way, the human body is like every other sentient creature that is in nature in the way that they sustain themselves. Now, of course, there are certain herbivore species that only eat plants, but of course plants are alive and sentient in their own way as well. So they are sustaining their existence by taking the essence of plants in the same way that a carnivore takes it from a sentient creature. So each and every being that is aware here is doing the same thing, with the possible exception of plants themselves that are sustaining their existence through photosynthesis, just taking the energy of the sun in order to sustain themselves. And so you look at something like photosynthesis and you say, well, hold on a second. If these plants are sustaining themselves through sunlight alone, why would our design be any different? Surely, if you were going to design a world for awareness to experience itself through, wouldn't you prefer a situation where the body or the vessel would just naturally sustain itself from the environment and there would be no need to kill or end the life of another sentient creature or plant to sustain the existence? It's funny, I came across someone who made a comment that made me laugh along these lines, and my apologies to whoever did so that I cannot remember exactly who it was right at this moment off the top of my head, but among the great indignities that I must suffer through as a human being here, the greatest indignity is that I have to get up every morning and walk over to the toilet and expel foul, disgusting matter from a hole in my body. And I just started laughing. I mean, maybe I was in the mood to just laugh at something in that way when I came across it. But it is getting at a deeper point that relates to what I'm discussing here regarding the issue of whether the design of this food chain has the best interests of those who are subject to it in mind. And when you look at it objectively, there is a tendency to look at it in a way that, well, this is suspect. I mean, intuitively to me, that's what makes sense. But again, I'm just some idiotic human with a small mind looking at the situation. So I brought up the indigenous native aspect of this because there would be people, and I guess you could add hunters into this, where they would see a certain beauty in this food chain situation. They would just say, well, that's the way it is. Life consumes life. And when you're actually in it, you have a different perspective and a different resonance surrounding the whole process, as opposed to the purely intellectual way that I'm looking at it right now, examining the situation from a distance. But still, intuitively, the food chain doesn't make much sense to me as I perceive it in this realm. And you look at the way the body's constructed and you say, okay, is this kind of what all of the ancient stories are getting into when they're talking about the fall? In other words, are the memories or the feeling, the suspicion that is intuitive to my being that there is a different way that this could be, is that a memory that is from a time on the earth, or is that a memory that is from somewhere else that's just in my being, in my awareness? And I'm pulling on that memory and applying it to the earth as if the earth used to be like that, but maybe it actually never was. And that's just a memory that I have from somewhere else, or a feeling that I'm intuiting from another place, a different realm, a different dimension. Alternatively, it could be a situation where it is an actual memory of how it used to be on the earth. And then, like I said, this would be where the stories of the quote-unquote fall come into play, where perhaps there was a different energetic environment due to various cosmic cycles on this planet. I mean, that's what they tell us it is, a planet. So I'll just use that word for ease of communication. I mean, you should know enough by now to know that all of these terms that I'm using are not beyond question, and you should always be questioning, well, is it a planet? So anyway, perhaps this environment existed on the earth, and then due to whatever cycles take place, there was a metaphorical fall in consciousness to the point where nature deteriorated into this vicious, life-consuming life food chain, perhaps out of necessity. If there was a cataclysmic type event that disturbed everything that had taken place, and this could be as simple as the climate changing in a way where the way people sustained themselves was no longer possible. And so they had to resort to starting to eat other creatures that were aware just like they were. And this was just necessary. That's what they had to do. Maybe it was a situation like that, or maybe it's always been like that, and there was never any sort of different scenario taking place, and it's just always been like that here. And any ideas that are in your awareness about a different way that it could be are coming from somewhere else. Maybe the predecessors of human beings on this planet were animals, like every other quote-unquote animal that we refer to now. It's just that our particular species had its brain upgraded by an intelligence, a different awareness, to the point where we still possessed all of the same anatomy that an animal would have, and we were still bound by the food chain in that way, but now our minds were upgraded to the point that we developed the ability to question our own actions. And this is the source of all the existential angst that bubbles to the surface when we look around and question what it is exactly that we're doing. And this is where all of the mind control in society comes from, as a form of distraction that keeps the population from questioning too much. Regardless of the actual way that the events played out or the reasoning, we are still in the situation that we are in. And that gets into all sorts of philosophical problems. Maybe not even philosophical, but just realistic problems where your pride comes into play and you say, oh, well, it can't be the one scenario where it's always been like this, because then that would mean that I'm here for some reason. And why is that? Surely I'm a good person and I wouldn't deserve to be placed in this sort of environment. Well, I don't know about that. You would like to think that, but hey, I mean, there's so much that we don't know because our memories are completely wiped when we're incarnated here, and we have no idea where we come from or what we're doing here. Or speaking for myself, I have no idea about those things. I have certain suspicions, but there is no way that I feel confident enough, especially with other people listening to this, that I would want to say with certainty that any of those suspicions are true and accurate. Because again, my mind is so small compared to the scales of creation that are capable of creating the very thing that I am perceiving. I'm having difficulty even perceiving what it is. So how could I possibly put myself in the state of awareness that would create it in the first place? But the question I'm asking here goes to the idea of whether it's, like I said, always been like this, or if something artificial has infected it, for lack of a better term. Some awareness that infected life here and turned it into what we see now, and it wasn't always the case. And ultimately, when you do this thought experiment and you engage in this philosophical exercise, you inevitably come to the conclusion that it doesn't really matter so much which one it is, because regardless, you're now in the situation that you're in, where life is consuming life in this insane food chain, and we're all bound by it due to the energetic environment of the planet currently. And maybe that's changing, perhaps, but maybe it isn't. Who knows? Regardless, we're all stuck in the situation currently. And there are people who will talk about ideas that are beyond what we currently have to do to survive. But again, place those people in the wild and see if they can really survive with that idea only in their mind, and not eventually resort to consuming some form of life in order to sustain themselves.